So welcome and good afternoon to everyone, both sides of the Atlantic. First and foremost, as usual, the usual thing, please, if you don't want to be filmed, just switch off your camera and mic. You can still take part of in the proceedings, and only you won't be recorded. So welcome in. This is the third sixth talk of this series on the living memory of cities. And as part of these talks today, we have Patrick Lynch of Lynch Architects, who will be talking to us about Civic Ground in a number of examples in the City of Westminster and also in Hackney. Also part of these talks, in 25th of May, we're going to have Philip Christou, who shall be talking about poetic transformation of topography. So we're very much looking forward to that too. We've been working on a sort of institutional framework to accommodate these various initiatives and events. And we're hoping to advertise a second series starting in October. That will be quite soon. The most talks are confirmed, and you should be able to access the program in due course. We shall keep you posted. So tonight, the session will be again hosted by Eric Parry, whom you shall have on your screen as well. Patrick should be talking hopefully for 30 minutes, although there is freedom in that, so that we can then have another 30 minutes of questions and answers. To start us off, Nick Temple, whom you should also have on your screen, should be able to perhaps ask a question or two just to warm us up, but I'll leave it entirely to your own discretion, Nick. Matthew, I think, would also like to maybe ask a few questions, and perhaps Peter Carl, if he wishes, but it's entirely open and just to start us off. So for now, that's all from me, and I think Matthew has a few things he might like to say, namely welcoming everybody and a few notices on the part of London Met, if he's able at this stage. So Matthew, over to you.
Thank you. I am actually going to say very little today because the reason that some of you were waiting in the waiting room longer than usual is we've had a little bit of a technical hitch, but we seem to be sorting things out. José has already mentioned the final talk in the first series, which is Philip Christou on the 25th of May. And then also we're all inviting you, those of you who register for that or who are already on our mailing list will receive notice of the second series, which we're currently planning to start in October later this year. So thank you all for coming, and over to Eric.
I've got very little to add to that, but I would say that, you know, I look to Patrick and his colleagues with admiration for their breadth and scope. There's an energy and a talent that's evident, absolutely evident. And not only for the practices work, but also for the work of academic output, both in the studio of the schools he's involved with, particularly Liverpool, but also for the Journal of Contemporary Architecture that he produces with others biannually, which obviously adds to our sort of sense of connectivity in an incredibly important way. There's a sort of a lengthy haiku, really, in what I read in his and their mantra of good design is like good poetry. Both entail the search for a poetic economy of means, and I think we'll be treated to a lot of examples of that in the work of the practice that Patrick is going to take us to now. So over to you, Patrick. We're really looking forward to your presentation.
Hi guys, thanks for inviting me. I'm very happy to be here. I can't use, I can't share my screen, so the slides are going to be shown. I think Matthew's going to drive the presentation, so you're gonna have to bear with me saying next, I'm afraid, a lot. Do you want to start? Yeah, I've got a lot to show you, so I'm going to try and rattle through this as quickly as possible. But bear with me. I might go not a bit longer than half an hour, I'm afraid, José. We're a bit late, I'm aware. If you go to the next slide, please. So roughly speaking, those of us in London are familiar with where Victoria is, part of the City of Westminster, and where Hackney is. And the next slide. This is the view out of my window now. It's of a gasometer by the Regent's Canal, and some examples of things that we've made, which then became buildings. And I think it's that really that I'm going to try and talk to you about. This talk has been inspired. It's been rattling around in my brain. A couple of years ago, I think there was a book launch, Eric, of yours at the Charter House. And Eddie Heathcote asked me very provocatively, why are our buildings so much better than the other buildings at Victoria? And I attempted to answer then. And partly, I think the answer is clearly to do with working methods. It has to do with the combination of the computer and handwork. And partly, I think also it's to do with a cultural reading, how one makes a cultural reading of a place. And the next slide. So this is the view from the library. There's obviously this kind of high-powered computing going on, Revit, etc. Next slide. Next slide. And also these very big models. You can see, you may have seen some over my shoulder. This is of the ground plane and the first couple of floors of a housing scheme in Hackney, where, put very simply, the topic of ground and its civilized or civic character is something that is overlooked often in the design of housing in particular, and specifically in the 20th century city. Obviously, it's highly problematic following Corbusier's 5 points, where the ground plane of public housing in particular is often determined by turning circles of service vehicles, plant and cars. And that's something I've kind of seeking to address. Next slide. And as Eric alluded to, the office is now also a publishing house, and yet we're kind of potentially doing kind of phase 3 addition to this house in Norfolk. Next slide. Next slide. Whereby the combination of kind of, I guess, sort of analogical, poetic, mimetic collage technique that I learned kind of secondhand at Cambridge from Peace Carl and Dalibor Besley as a way to bring together, I suppose, the kind of sense of the primordial conditions, both of which the topography and the one of the natural world in relationship to spatial themes, allowed me to progress. Next slide. To quite early on in my career, to see how a house in the countryside might be seen as a villa, and that the relationship between making, writing, cultural conditions of a house for an artist in relationship to a cultivated landscape, next slide, gave me a kind of way to talk to her and to talk to the planners about what our ambitions for the project were. And the trick has been to try to maintain that working methodology. So on the left is a small house in Hackney, on the right a large apartment building I'm going to talk to you about. Next slide. Where the analysis of how a building sits at the end of a terrace, next slide, goes hand in hand with tectonic delight and attention to, in this case, how to make, next slide, a house out of green oak for a carpenter, next slide. Have a kind of civic dimension whereby the living room on the second floor turns the corner, and unlike the typical layout of a London street where you have speculative houses, at best a public house, a pub on the corner, no real kind of plasticity to the form of a building or any sense of the promenade of architecture, its temporal situational dimension. Modest things, but an early attempt working, back and forth from the scale of next slide. I suppose ideas in the tradition of phenomenological hermeneutics. Next slide, and the scale of the body. These 3 books I didn't publish. Next slide, but I have become a publisher, and the Journal of Architecture is literally a kind of network made up of people that I've met at Venice Biennale and conferences, and I guess it's a kind of extended project of friendship, or mitsein, as Peter and Nick would style the relationship between the kind of civic dimension of Heidegger's phenomenology and Levinas's sense of the other. It's an ongoing project, doesn't seem to have an end, it just seems to grow, and ultimately, if Aristotle's observation that the purpose of knowledge is friendship and the purpose of friendship is the city, it's a kind of civic contribution. Next slide. One example of this, manifestation of this, was when David Sheffield came along, invited Eric and I and Howard Tompkins to exhibit together at the Venice Biennale in 2012. The title of the exhibition was Common Ground, which was actually an earlier version of Civic Ground. Kieran was involved in the seminar at the CAS that Peter had established, having moved the course kind of the Essex-Cambridge trajectory to London Met, which was entitled Practical Wisdom, which is next slide, kind of a reference to Aristotle's distinguishing of phronesis, or practical wisdom, from wholly scientific and wholly self-interested artistic pursuits and different forms of knowledge. The implication being that practical wisdom is the best type of description, if you need to think about what architecture is, really. Next slide. The Venice exhibition moved back to London. Next slide, and included within it a seminar at the AA, which Eric also participated in, alongside some planners, clients, members of the planning committee, academics, other architects and artists. And that seemed to me to be the kind of reflection on the sort of conversations that one has when one starts to move beyond the scale of a house, to start thinking at the scale of the city. And the next slide, the invitation to work in Venice allowed me to begin to investigate the broader context of the projects we'd won just before that in 2010, working on Victoria Street. Victoria Street is this oddity. It's a kind of wholly technologically invented, or the result of technology. It's the old canal basin, which is now the Victoria line and the Victoria train station, making a connection to the new Palace of Westminster, Parliament, and the result of the building of an embankment that got rid of marshland, into which is then placed the District and Circle line, which runs parallel to just to the north of Victoria Street. Next slide. So despite being cheek by jowl with the most important representational buildings in the UK and a UNESCO World Heritage Site, e.g. Buckingham Palace, the House of Parliament, Westminster Abbey, etc., it was mostly until recently like this. Next slide. South-facing flat glass facades that pay no heed either to the status of the buildings they neighbour nor to any solar orientation. So neither the natural world nor the kind of civic dimension of architecture is acknowledged. And this building is what we removed. Next slide. On the right is Westminster City Hall, the tallest figure on the street. Next slide. And this is another site next to the Frank Matchen's Victoria Palace Theatre, where we're now also building some more buildings. So it's a combination of kind of analogical fragments of bits of kind of palazzo types, very, very tall towers, a kind of copy of a Milanese project and a Manhattan project, kind of bits of the Pan Am building and bits of Gio Ponti. And then these newer buildings, which similarly are very big and don't acknowledge arguably the morphology of the city, its metabolism, nor its relationship to the natural world. Flat glass facades, some of whom which are done by Caesar Pelli, ex-head of school at Yale University. So to answer Peter's question that he began his talk with, is how does Hudson Yards happen? That's really, I guess, what's underlying my response to this. I said, well, next slide, kind of lack of observation of what the city is like, good or ill. Next slide. No real critical approach. This is actually a medieval alleyway between two modernist buildings built in the 1970s that nonetheless accepted the urban grain of the ancient city, and as a consequence, this pedestrian alleyway used to, until recently, have a running shop. So it was perfect. This chap, you can see, has got his suit on, come from his lunch hour. Well, he's trying out running shoes. So next slide. There's actually quite a lot going on in that location if you could be bothered to look. And one outtake from the PhD was this book Mimesis. Next slide. And one major theme in it is the essay called Civic Architecture was kind of looking in comparison with Piccadilly, what has been lost in the kind of rich depth condition, both spatially and I suppose programmatically and representationally from the traditional city. And this is obviously Burlington House, which is now the Royal Academy. Next slide. Where the New Zealand house is a kind of dislocated, alienated architecture, but nonetheless this happens. Of course, horse guards go past because of where it is in relationship to the palace. Next slide. More, I suppose, kind of porous hinterland of hotels and mansion blocks in Victoria. Next slide. Next slide. Next slide. The cathedral, as it kind of establishes a kind of new urban grain. Next slide. The Catholic cathedral, I mean, kind of analogical types, bits of it, kind of Italy, juxtaposed with London, supplanted. Next slide. An oddity, built without steps up to it, and in fact the steps that were used for the Ben Jonson's and Inigo Jones's masks were used to cut the head off Archbishop Laud and of course Charles I. The sense that somehow it was okay in a kind of private territory to act like a Baroque prince, but don't sully Puritan England with this. Thanks very much. Next slide. That there are. This is what Piccadilly kind of. I think this is Aston Webb kind of morphing with a kind of underground technology, the architecture adopting itself to it. Next slide. But mostly it's kind of ignored. Now, in a bit more detail, I'm going to talk to you. I wish if I could click the button, I'd be moving a lot faster. I'm going to try my best to kind of whiz through this now. I'm going to show you 3 projects now. One built, one being built, and one about to go out to tender. Next slide. So part of mimesis, it has 2 arguments really. One is that the imagination draws on memory, and that memory, in Aristotle's sense, is poetic and is metamorphic and transforming. And another observation from Aristotle about the role of chance and play and luck ultimately in the imagination, and that therefore the kind of mimetic act itself of learning to play a musical instrument or to dance or to play a sport, like the mimosa plant, has a kind of response to natural phenomena, and that has a bodily constituent. It's often forgotten when mimesis is often discussed in architecture. It's discussed in terms of models or types. Actually, there's a whole physical dimension to this work. Next, which I suppose brings together the intellectual and the haptic, just from a heuristic learning, whereby the act of doing itself is the thing that allows you to understand what it is you're doing. Next slide. Next slide. And understanding where you are and situating yourself is part of that task. So those photographs that you saw are the result of a series of walks that David and Grandolge and I made together as friends through the city, trying to learn and understand the broader context in which I was working. These are the two projects I'm going to talk about now for Landsec. Next slide. So this is a model with the Houses of Parliament towards the east, the Abbey, etc. Next slide. Put simply, having kind of made this reading of the problem of Victoria Street is it's not enough like a high street in the way in which traditional Victorian street is, and in which Piccadilly in particular is a highly orchestrated, articulate version thereof. Nonetheless, there is a cathedral, a town hall, a theatre and a train station. And despite the kind of monolithic, faceless or aniconic architecture of Victoria Street, there is this urban hinterland of kind of rich life, and that what one needed to do was to intensify the sense of a high street, but also to offer as a kind of succor to that, or antidote, a much more gentle pedestrian route linking Belgravia to Christchurch Square and the Abbey and going north towards the Royal Parks. And that's really what the project entails. We didn't do this master plan, KPF but initiated it, but we are going to end up doing, I think, more buildings than anybody else on the street. Next slide. And this is drawing, effectively drawing it as a series of civic rooms, the cathedral, the train station, even St Martin's in the Fields, Eric, if you look top right hand corner, is there as a public room, because of course the way in which the monarchy move around from the city palace to their church, Reality Arch, down to the House of Commons and then back again, is a kind of I suppose kind of urban topography of a kind of series of civic rooms. I mean, but really basic stuff. But nonetheless, next slide. What I'm getting at here is that it's basically, just as it's important to use a computer and to draw by hand and to make models, it's also important to make readings of things in different ways in order to understand what it is you're dealing with. So you don't just produce buildings which are like objects and alienating when you get within 100 meters of them. Next slide. So, for example, when Bentley built the cathedral on the ruins of an old prison that was in the marsh, he didn't waste a lot of money orienting it cardinal axis east. He just accepted it would be cheaper to build it like this, and then built a series of mansion blocks and streets which paid for it, which established an urban grain. And we, in effect, decided to take one of those blocks, which are roughly 24 meters deep, and place it next to the town hall, knowing that the building in between that urban grain was being refurbished. And ultimately, next slide, what we were hoping was that this kind of rhythm of mass and void and scale of things stepping up nonetheless from the cathedral, where it was genuflecting, as it were, low towards God, being confident in its ascent towards the town hall, but stepping away from it, next slide, would create a better threshold for the town hall, so that the town hall as a type is a building. It's not particularly interesting. It's a flat-faced 60s tower, but it is the town hall and it's tall. That these relationships would become apparent, and that this rhythm of relationships, e.g. blocks which are 24 meters wide with subdivided into 12-meter bays, i.e. 12 by 9 is the perfect dimension for a concrete office building grid, which is the long wall building on the left, and then 12-meter gaps between the buildings. And then the orientation of the building would create a kind of hierarchy where rather than just having a linear portico, the face of the town hall would have a kind of extended ground. Next slide. A deeper threshold. This is a view from the Cathedral Piazza. You can't see the residential building, but you can see how, just a simple example, the top floor of the office building is cut back in plan to have a south-facing balcony. The consequence of that is it's not taller than the town hall. So this, the significance of this tower as a town hall is, yeah, Mammon is not as important as Demos. Next. This is an investigation into how to make a south-facing facade, an eco-skeleton that allows the building to be naturally ventilated. Next slide. Next slide. The next slide. the long wall building could be slug-like, and it steps up in section, but the fins of the facade get closer together as well, which means they are as they get closer together, if they stayed the same depth, they would cast themselves into shadow, so that there's a matter of kind of material redundancy in the facade material. This is Giroponti's Casa Girasole, or House of the Sunflower in Rome, which is a kind of kinetic, interactive facade. You move within it. There's much less opportunity in an office building than in a house for this, but I thought it was a useful reference. Next slide. And in effect, as you can see here, that as the fins get closer together to make the building appear more statuesque, they diminish in depth, and so they're stepping in, and this is effectively a form of entasis. Next slide. You're looking out there through one of these smoke vents, which are there to insulate the building, but also to purge smoke in times of fire. What it allows you to do is to create a stable door and a balcony, and thus, in the future, when we have electric cars and there's no noise pollution and dirty air, for the building to become naturally ventilated. So this whole thing is kind of an example of what Alberti would call second nature, if you like, or a form of expression of virtue. Next slide. Has exposed concrete ceilings, capillary cooling pipes in it. So there's basically a massive thermal mass coolth sink, exuding coolth. Next slide. And this one column in the entrance is a circle, so the eye doesn't jag on corners at the bottom, but becomes a square at the top to adjust itself to the Catalan vaults, the die-grid ceiling. Next slide. It's also a door handle that we designed for the building, which is soft in your hand when you pull it and hard and flat when you push it. It's kind of, I suppose, a form of wit and humour for the architect. Next slide. But it's an extreme example of basically trying to continue to think at the scale of the human body at the same time as you're thinking at the scale of the street. This is the view of the town hall that's opened up by the building stepping back. So you have the layer of the pavement for the people in a hurry, an inner layer within the lee of the building, and then an in layer again into the colonnade as you enter into the restaurant at the base of the apartment building. Next slide. The brise soleil here is inverting what happens on the office building.
So that showed up. Yep. All kinds of.
So if the office building is a wall building, this is a tower. If the office building is a metal building with, if you saw within the facade, bits of onyx in a solar screen that deals with glare, held, so it's kind of stone held within metal. This is a metal held within stone and inverted in elevation, so the fins are closer together so that people on the balconies at the lower levels can have privacy. Further apart at the top of the building, but nonetheless, next slide, always enough mass so that you don't need to use fossil fuels to cool the building. Next slide. And in mimesis, I realised through the power of digital photography and the way in which the internet remembers where you took things, that the sketches for this were done in Venice in the Cadoro. Next slide. Whereby a kind of mixed-use mercantile grand house on a boulevard, in analogical terms, could be considered as a south-facing deep threshold to Victoria Street, as a similar kind of civic representational street, with churches on the horizon, obviously. I mean, this is the what I'm kind of interested in is how the imagination works, both in a reasonable way, things you're conscious of, and how your body works in reaction to phenomena, and therefore saves one's work from simply being a demonstration of a theory, but is something else, something transformed. Next slide, please. Works at the scale of the hand. This is basically a detail to stop anybody putting a glass of wine on it, falling and killing and on the street. Next slide. Really what it is a kind of screen that allows all sorts of different activities to occur within it. Next slide. This is the threshold to City Hall I mentioned. Next slide. And then in removing the existing building, which connected itself to the town hall, this space was exposed, and the council asked for public art, or suggestions for it. And the idea was we make a public artwork that was similar materially to the existing building, so not embarrassing it intending, next slide, to enhance one's understanding of, I mean, very precious these spaces. No commerce, it's the entrance to a block of flats, and I suppose analogically the best thing you could say is it's a kind of garden. Next slide. And working with the artist Blaise Luxembourg, with the idea that somehow the ecological science, the building physics that have gone into the facade making and the kind of ethos of that might become a narrative that not only is kind of ornamental and representationally comprehensible, but also physically available. Next slide. She said you're basically talking about a room in a forest, aren't you? There's a kind of landscape idea from Vogt, with it would be a kind of garden, wood, arboretum. Next slide. Next slide. There's more distortion and interruption, kind of pixelation of digital noise in the images as the closer they are towards the street. As you get further away from the noise and distraction of the street. Next slide. The images coalesce into this view into a forest from the point at which you enter the building. Next slide. This is a column designed by Timorous Beasties. Next slide. So the presence of the occupant of this building, their experience of the city is personalised. It's different to the very, very public threshold of the town hall. And in essence, I suppose what we're doing is thinking about kind of spatial typology, kind of the gaps in the city, having a kind of formal characteristic, but also the things that you touch, having a way to ground your experiences. Next slide. In multiple ways, you know, the naming of a public space after a beloved councillor and chair of the planning committee, a kind of discretion that allows residential life to occur. Next slide. Cheek by jowl with political demonstrations. These are UNESCO trade unionists complaining about 0 hours contracts for cleaners. Next slide. And of course, this stuff, you know, still happens all the time. Next slide. We're also now working for the same client, Landsec, on 2 other projects, or maybe one could say there are three buildings grouped around the Frank Matcham's Theatre, a tall office building at the rear, and a complex melange or collage of figures, including a screen to a ventilation shaft. Next slide, which is what you can see here. This is a view from the train station. So in the foreground, I've taken the colour out because I think everybody else, including the judges of the Carbuncle Cup, don't have much time for these recent buildings. However, if there is these kind of 2 scales happening, very, or too big and too small, very, very big and scale less, and quite intricate at the lower levels. Next slide. Our architecture is an attempt, I guess, to kind of mediate between these layers of experience. Next slide. Whereby there's a kind of civic depth, as Peter would say, where the urban hinterland and the foreground have a kind of reciprocity. There's more detail on the buildings which are closer to the street, next to the older buildings, and less detail at the back, but nonetheless a kind of degree of depth occurring both spatially and in terms of the way the facades work, but also in the section of the buildings. Next slide. And depth, very simply, has to do with shade and a kind of future-oriented, ecologically responsible architecture. Next slide. This is it in the factory last week. And so the master plan at this point has a kind of head, this small tower. Next slide. Next slide. And a restaurant on the roof, various roof gardens. Next slide. A piano nobile at the first floor, grand public room. Next slide. Where the tectonics of engineered timber in this case, which is required because we're building on a series of tube lines and sewers, and the loading is incredibly, it's very difficult to build a lot, becomes analogically a kind of piano nobile in the grand palazzo, where the downstand beams, which is just a simple kind of grid of structure and lighting create the possibility for a public room to exist. Next slide. Next slide. I mean, these are basically examples from Masis of my kind of scrapbook of stuff. At the front of the site to the south, a building that was to be a library is now just simply, next slide, a kind of version of Frank Matcham's analogical Palazzo Victoria Palace Theatre. What you're looking at is a deep facade, solar shading, balconies, extremely energy efficient corporate life. Next slide. And of course, we've been working at this at various scales. We built it at 1 to 3 in the Inhabitable Models exhibition with Eric and Harth Tompkins. Next slide. Next slide. Next slide. Just kind of put this in to sort of reiterate this kind of effort of physical architecture. Next slide. I'm completely convinced that the more physical you can, the closer you can get to the physical experience of an occupant or inhabitant or visitor to a building, the more care you can put into it. And I'm using that in precisely referring to Heidegger's use of the word care and Handwerk. The better the building will be. Next slide. This is a project competition we won for Westminster Cathedral Piazza, where we proposed to build a baldacchino to commemorate, next slide, when it was now St. John Henry Newman, to create a new kind of threshold between this naked corporate space and the extreme juxtaposition with this incredibly kind of introverted Byzantine world. Next slide. Okay, I'm going to try and rush through two things really quickly. What I'm hoping to do is to demonstrate two things. Firstly, that the methodology of designing in this way, multiple scales at once with lots of different media, works both in a highly orchestrated spatial situation such as a coroner's court for the Queen's coroner, and also for a housing block. And ultimately what I'm making is a kind of reading of the city. Next slide. So this is Westminster Coroner's Court on Horseferry Road, to the right of the train station on the way to the Houses of Parliament. Next slide. The site next to the Coroner's Court is a taxi rank. It's always left like that because if there's ever a terrorist atrocity or pandemics, the bodies are brought to the Queen's Coroner's Court and laid out as a temporary morgue. This happened for the Grenfell fire, it happened for the recent terrorist attacks on Westminster Bridge and in Borough. You used to drive a house and cart in and around the building with a kind of horseshoe landscape plan. In the 70s, the council built a morgue or mortuary. Next slide. Which is rather faceless. There's some quite good Lutyens housing. Next slide. The kind of the Victoria, this is this kind of more this kind of, you know, one of my students called Catholic world. This is Anglo-Catholic kind of niches and saints and next slide, kind of, you know, high church 19th century character. Interestingly, the Coroner's Court is a big house in many ways. It's highly subtle architecture. The bay window has a niche in it with a window seat where you wait, next slide, before you go into the Coroner's Court. The Coroner's Court itself is a kind of grand hall, walnut lining, a dais where the coroner sits, a fireplace with some fine quality faience tiles. Next slide. Because it's used increasingly for events that require a jury, a change to the Coroner's Act recently means there were more jurors involved. It lacks a juror's room, but because it's also used in emergencies, it needs a second Coroner's Court. And in effect, what we've done is simply taken the spatial type of the barrel vaulted hall in miniature and made that the new hall. Next slide. And rather than seeking to imitate the architecture, next slide, taken a cast of that inner world and placed it next to the existing Coroner's Court as a kind of stone sepulchre in itself. Next slide. So you enter, ordinarily you go, the police have just called you in the middle of the night and you're going to identify a body straight through the centre of the plan into a room where you identify the body. To the right is a Garden of Remembrance that we built a few years ago with funding from the Commoners Fund from the Grenfell fire, initially for victims of the families of victims of that. To the rear of the plan, new office space, toilets, a press room, etc. And the front of the plan, a room for the families to wait when they come back, typically about 6 weeks later, to have their case heard, and a private garden for them. You go up the grand staircase. Next slide. You see the niche at the top of the stairs and the window seat into the big hall, or to the left of it, the new stone building. This is it as a juror's room. Next slide. You can see that that's it with a small courtroom. Next slide. The timber wall removed, a large courtroom. Next slide. As I said, it's conceived of as a standalone building, so it has a stone lining to the corridor. There's a step in the section which relates to the step in the section of the adjacent building. Next slide. This is the Garden of Remembrance, which takes this John Summersonian idea of an edicular, scalar version of the Commoners' Court down a scale, and it's a series of next slide, benches with curves below them. They're also planters simply for the bereaved to sit. Off of eBay, we bought a Victorian fountain, put it there for some white noise, and at the end, next slide, this niche. Everything else apart from the niche is cast against rough concrete, and this is cast against perspex, so it's smooth. So as well as your shadow being projected into it, there's also a kind of ghostly figure of yourself within this white mirror. So it's a kind of memento mori. Next slide. So it's a scalar version of the building itself. The north-facing elevation to the street has no windows in it. There's a huge problem of paparazzi with long lens photography invading the privacy of the bereaved. Lots of very famous people have had their cases heard here. So we invited our friend Brian Clark, the stained glass artist, to collaborate with us. Next slide. On the creation of a series of pieces of glass. This is the Garden of Reflection, as we call it, with a tree. The windows beyond our office space. So this pond is to stop the public interacting with the workings of the building. Next slide. This is the waiting room for the families of the bereaved. So it's another kind of edicular, scalar, niche-like kind of grand Edwardian, late Victorian Inglenook, I guess, with the stained glass providing privacy but not making it look institutional. A cut-off stone pillar for you to put your cup of coffee or your tea on. It allows various members of the family groups who often, when they come together for these types of events, haven't spoken for a number of years, to have a kind of distance from each other. Granny can sit on the upholstered bench, and other members of the family can stand and in a huddle and talk. Next slide. This is Brian's studio. Next slide. But Brian's been there on a number of occasions, notably when his friend Francis Bacon died, and he just said it's just so awfully utilitarian and uncivic nowadays, these places, that any work of art gives you something to hold on to grip in your extremis. Next slide. This is part of the workspace. This is a bit more detail, the corridor into the Commoners' Court. Next slide. So you go in one door, you come out the other door. The step in the section has a clerestory window where the image of the sunflower, this kind of potently primitive symbol of regeneration or hope, coalesces into a figure. Next slide. That's the effect of the stained glass in that corridor, which shrouds your view of the chiller plants on the roof of the mortuary, letting in light at noon and affecting the ambience of the courtroom itself, the old courtroom. Next slide. That's the courtroom set up as a courtroom. Next slide. And as jury rooms. Next slide. And this is the coincidence of afternoon sunlight coming in through the western elevation, through the tree that we're going to plant, through the stained glass, at the point at which, on a sunny day in half the year when the judge is summing up their findings, a highly intense, highly orchestrated, I mean, it's entirely secular, but there is a degree, I guess, of a kind of ritualistic civic life. My father, when he died, we went to the coroner's court, and it was an incredibly poignant, very memorable occasion. And so the trick here is to have an architecture of acoustics, acoustic linings, and a kind of background intensity, if you like, sufficient to allow you to focus on the speech of the coroner. Next slide. That's leaving. Next slide. So ultimately, yet again, like the Garden of Remembrance, is like the Silver Forest artwork that we did at Blaise Luxembourg, a kind of garden analogy, where the horizon of human finitude, as Peter would say, is available to you as an urban situation. Simply, the architecture is completed by something else. Next slide. I'd say, yeah. Next slide. Very quickly, I'm just going to show you this. This is we get the tender returns back on Friday. It's a project for Hackney Council. It's a combination of market housing, intermediate housing, where a key worker can buy a 50% share, and social housing. Next slide. For those of you that know, Old Street Roundabout is the kind of cusp or threshold between Islington, Hackney, and the City of London. South of it is a kind of intensely commercial district, and because London obviously is this kind of series of villages, Hoxton itself has a kind of metabolism. Running north-south is Hoxton Street, and to the left of it, Murray Grove, which you can see is where our site is. The North Shoreditch Park. Chipperfield has built some buildings recently, along with County Carson. Hackney Council are becoming a very enlightened client. Since 1979, when Margaret Thatcher basically made it impossible for local authorities to borrow money to build housing, there's been arguably a loss of soul in modern architecture. Practices like Eric and ours have kind of consoled ourselves by trying to remake the city with decent, civic, ecologically oriented office buildings, and using that arguably financially to support our other projects for other clients and cultural projects. The possibility of building new housing, I think, changes the game completely and stops architecture being simply a formalistic game. Next slide, which ultimately is probably what was going on with, that's what Hudson Yards is, the hundreds of thousands of pounds per student spent on Ivy League educations, to produce what, newer, faster, better shapes, a kind of, freedom from what, freedom for what, aimless wandering. This isn't to say that modernist architecture doesn't have massive problems, and in this case, the problem with the domination of the motor car and road engineering is writ large, and the fact that as you enter the estate, there's these kind of signs telling you where you are, because of course there's no real urban metabolism to allow you to orient yourself. There's a tall tower, a lower block. Next slide. And a car park structure, 3 stories tall, 2 above ground and 1 below ground, completely cutting this, as if dropped from a kind of a Junkers bomber onto the site tower. Next slide. The ground plane further undermined and alienated from the city by the creation of a car park. And the consequence of this type of kind of Palladian villages planning is that councils like Hackney have loads and loads of land, and the diminishing of car use means there's the opportunity to remove car parks. Next slide. And to produce a better integration of these, I think it's fair to say, rather alienating projects into the urban grain of the metropolis. It's quite a fine neoclassical 19th century church just off of Pitfield Street. Beyond that, Hoxton Street is the kind of high street. So it's a kind of urban hinterland. This is the kind of residential world of 1870. Next slide, which we assumed had been bombed in the war. Large parts of it remain. This is Shepherdess Walk just to the west. Everything would have looked like this until, next slide. The planners did this. It wasn't bombed. They removed, or the City Council, Hackney Council rather, removed large bits of Victorian stock. One imagines this is before John Betjeman had established the Victorian Society. And the value of these buildings. Next slide. So only bits of this were built, the tower, the car park, without the community centre in it, and a lower block. Next slide. Next slide. Next slide. There's a kind of COD contextual architecture going on, where the white render of the lower parts of the Victorian houses and the buff brick are kind of writ large in the white painted concrete infrastructure, megastructure of the buildings, and infill brick panels. Next slide. But actually it's completely alienating. Next slide. Because there's a car park in the basement, to ventilate it, there's literally Heidegger's rift, as he describes it, the rift between the modern world of technology and the traditional city. Next slide. And next slide. And in fact, because there's rail tunnels running beneath the site, they didn't excavate enough, so you actually have to walk up to your front door. There are these quite impressive thick concrete columns coming to ground. Next slide. But it's highly alienating. You can't engage with the building. You have to step over a bridge to get to it. Next slide. There's lots of grass, but it's kind of municipal planting rubbish. You can't use it for anything. Can't play football on it. Can't have a picnic. Blah blah blah. Can't even hardly walk your dog. Next slide. Yet surrounding it are earlier examples of municipal housing. They suffer from having flats at ground floor, so yet again you get this problem of low fences and intermediate non-determinate territory. Next slide. But there are these pockets of public life occurring. This is a garden and a series of allotments. The local Kurdish community have taken it on. They grow food there, which they then turn into produce and sell actually on Broadway Market in a Turkish cafe around the corner from us. Next slide. I know all this because we lived on Hoxton Street for a number of years. So this is kind of analysis of the changes of scales. There's larger 9-storey buildings coming from Old Street Roundabout. There's some bizarrely tall towers there. The lower scale mid-century and early 20th century blocks, and these two very tall buildings. Next slide. And we lived in this building, which was a rather nice scheme. A postmistress's house for an estate. We had our office in the building with the patent glazing for a number of years, and as our family grew, the building grew. Next slide. Very economic construction. Next slide. But in a sea of cars, a kind of non-lieu, as Marc Auger would say, broken bottles on the ground from street drinkers, the tyres and the kids' buggies getting constantly pierced by this. Quite an alienating environment, massive kind of nighttime economy, very noisy. Next slide. Anyway, my reading effectively is a kind of typological, analytical, romantic, mimetic reading of the site is to say there's quite a lot of good gardens around here. And there's also in the City of London quite a lot of good housing. And there's nothing wrong with the housing in the tower. Its plan form is great. Everybody has a corner balcony, lots of daylight, great views. So let's put the Barbican there because that's the best example of housing that I know of. But it too, analogically, calls itself a Barbican. What that really means is it's got a wall around it because the entire ground floor of the complex is cars. So let's take Aldo Rossi's ground floor of the Galatasaray housing at Milan and place this onto the site to bring together the best example of a postmodern reading of the Civic Ground and a modernist reading of the benefits of fresh air and sunlight in housing, and smear, as it were, this hinterland of gardens onto the site. Next slide. And in essence, that's the competition winning proposal. Next slide. And this is what we're doing, introducing a new mid-range city composition of 3 blocks, mediating in scale between the tall towers and the newer scale of buildings being built on the other side of the street. Next image, please. Essentially remaking the corner of the site with a building which is perpendicular to it, And then the block to the left you're looking at is perpendicular to the tower and to the street at that point. Next slide. And in effect, filling in what was kind of car park between people and the city with, next slide, more people. Next slide. Next slide. And the consequence of accepting the layout of the streets is this deep threshold. Next slide, which in effect is a kind of next slide. Next slide. Natural perspective, whereby for the first time the residents of the tower will have an entrance where you can come out the straight door, walk straight out into the city, as it were. Next slide. Properly grounded. Next slide. And something which also deals with solar gain and has a top. Next slide. So this is the ground floor plan. Once again, you can walk along the busy route, a fast route to the street, or you can start to engage with the new landscaping plan and walk through the deep thresholds of the building. You can even walk, if you're a resident, straight through the plan of the building. The ground we're scooping out to build these the new basement for the building is going to level the site. So whilst there will remain a service route in from the back, the number of cars is radically diminished, and as the old people who own cars die out, more trees will be planted. And of course, now the big columns which ground the tower meet the ground. They take on a linguistic significance. They become a logic. There's a south-facing garden at the base of the tall tower in the centre of the scheme, and you can imagine sitting within that threshold, overlooking your children playing. And therefore that which was purely functional and structural becomes gregarious and civic. Next slide. The cores are central to the building. They all have corner balconies. It's basically imitating the best example of the modernist architecture of the existing tower. Next slide. This is the view from the east, the deep threshold I was saying. I'm almost finished. Next slide. View from the south, new mid-scale blocks. Next slide. Next slide. A loggia along the northern side. Next slide. So it's bricks and concrete like the existing building, highly insulated. Next slide. These are Revit models. So we've been able to build it one-to-one in the computer, as it were, which then becomes construction drawings. Next slide. A metal handrail that runs all the way around the facade. When it engages with the window, which has to be no taller than 85 centimetres off the ground so someone in a wheelchair can see out, you have a problem of falling, so that the balustrade fills in that gap in a kind of elegant, cheap, filigrane fashion. Next slide. The effect of this is a kind of thickening of the architecture as it engages with the human body, with these bowel vaults forming the edges of the balconies. Next slide. Next slide. Next slide. So as you approach the building, the detail increases. Next slide. This is the space between the building. Next slide. Next slide. In the plan of the building, you're entering straight into the living rooms, and effectively the city is presented to you with off of that main living room, kind of pockets of space. Concrete construction, single core, single staircase, very, very, very efficient, enabling one therefore to spend money on public realm and the detail of the architecture. Next slide. Because glitches in building regulations mean you need to have lots and lots of glazing, so you don't need to turn your lights on to be able to use the kitchen. There's a problem of solar gain. The way you mitigate that is to expose the concrete ceilings, giving an extra 30 centimetres floor ceiling height and using thermal mass to exude coolth, i.e. it's hot in the summer, it's cold in the summer at night, the building cools down, blah, 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 blah. That extends, next slide, onto the facade of the building. So the balcony is not a bolted on thing, it's a deep threshold psychologically and spatially and environmentally between you and the world. And that motif, next slide, continues as a kind of, what is effectively just a bus stop and a space for children to play in between. Next slide, the various kind of more or less public aspects of the site. When you're looking into a community building, a hall, next slide. Another block which acts as a gateway, a kind of partner figure to a 1990s block to the estate beyond, where its form is inverted again as a kind of inverse. The chamfer of the side of the building on the right becomes a niche in the facade of this building. Next slide. Which in plan means it has two balconies, one off of the bedroom facing west and one to the east. Next slide. Next slide. Next slide. Now, the consequence of this kind of reading of the city in terms of rhythm and rooms is that what we've realised at the end of the process of juxtaposing our 5-metre grid onto the previously existing site plan is the typology of the party wall city is actually recovered within our new composition. Now, we're not rebuilding the Georgian or the Victorian city, but we are trying to introduce a kind of scale of architecture, both in terms of height, mass and bulk and in terms of the plan, which is in between the scale of these large modernist blocks and the arguably kind of restricted private world of the Georgian or Victorian terrace. Now, we didn't start with this. It's the result of a reading of the city in terms of scale of urban form and a reading of it at the scale of the human body and in habitation. Next slide. I'm just going to conclude with this. So this is this book that came out of the PhD that arguably I started with Dalibor and Pisa in Cambridge in '95, which was about a Barac public garden and theatrical space, and became the topic of the term Civic Ground. Now, Civic Ground, next slide, effectively makes an argument that the birth of architectural theory and the birth of architecture as a profession in the Renaissance occurs as a form of moral philosophy. That Alberti, as papal envoy, professor of rhetoric, lawyer, public figure, moves from a book about the family to a book about civic life to a book about architecture and painting. Next slide. And is essentially teaching his patrons or future patrons and architects that in order to gain praise, you need to be virtuous. And in order to be virtuous, you need to build things, you need to offer things over. And in this case, it's the stoa of the Palazzo Riccioli that allows the participants in the popular festival to be witnessed by the Riccioli family as they walk past. Next slide. And that's to participate in city life. Now, David Leatherbarrow called this the sacrifice of space, and his contribution to the Venice Biennale in 2012 was an essay of that title, where he looked at the process by which Chericati was able to build his urban palazzo with a loggia on public land, and ultimately the city allowed him to do so, but the loggia is constantly open, it's part of the city. That gives him a balcony overlooking, facing west to the hills beyond the city. And I extrapolated that, in fact, Palladio's Palazzo della Magione, which is built on top of or in front of a series of medieval stalls in Verona, paid for by those burghers of the city, has an adjustment to the intercolonnation of the new facade, which allows you to see into the shops. And next slide. And so, contrary to a lot of academic misreadings of Palladio, next slide, and next slide. So this is kind of examples of the book. As the architect who's interested in autonomy, you will see this in the work of Pier Vittorio Borelli, Peter Eisenman, etc., Vitkova, Colin Rowe. Actually, that's not true. What Palladio is doing is a kind of, as a professional, is dealing with his clients' needs. The book effectively has a very simple idea, which is similar to my kind of retort or response to Peter's, why is Hudson Yard so terrible? Which is, why is American land art and land art in general so brilliant, and why is American architecture so poor? In essence, I think it's simply because they're reading the wrong books. The artists were reading Maurice Merleau-Ponty and becoming interested in perception and phenomenology, and the influx of Colin Rowe and Peter Eisenman, other figures to America, sadly brought with it a kind of academicism from Vitkova, where the already radically impoverished drawings of Palladio are turned into these kind of diagrams. Next slide. Next slide. And really what I've been looking at is the relationship between public art and architecture in a much more embodied, situated, participatory manner. So very St. Peter's Clipan, next slide, and this church by Caesar. Next slide. And I guess, unlike these kind of, highly reified, alienated drawings of Vitkova and Rowe and then Eisenman, kind of alienated from the city setting in which the buildings are set, both Taragni and Palladio's in this case, and Corbusier's. Next slide. Arguably the Villa Savoye is pretty alienated and isolated. So I kind of like to conclude with this kind of rather provocative statement, which is that the differences between Christian churches of various denominations are not as important as what they have in common, which is a sense of orientation both towards the participatory embodied aspects of human life and a kind of deeper dimension of culture. Put very simply, the recent rehabilitation of Paris, the removal of cars from Place de la République and the creation of not particularly distinguished architecturally but participatory public realm, which is a kind of soul of the city has been recovered. And that on the right you're looking at the work of Grania Hassett students from the University of Limerick and various Dublin schools of architecture going to what was known as the jungle in Calais and building very simply out of, I suppose, provisional materials, bits of canvas, things they were able to fit in the back of a lorry, a women's health centre. And the drawing by Grania on the bottom right there is what had grown up over a couple of years, a high street, housing, as it were, off of this, on that high street, a mosque, a church, a series of civic buildings. And then, in essence, without any road engineering or plumbing, it had attained a status, Robert Mull described it very beautifully for me, as basically being like a medieval village. No plumbing, but a really clear hierarchy and civic order, civilitas, and metabolic structure. And it's for those reasons that the French police got rid of it, because it began to attain a kind of stability and structure and order. And my argument ultimately, I suppose, is that there's more architecture in that than there is in Hudson's Yard, and arguably in all these examples where very highly educated, very wealthy members of the transnational class, as Leslie Sclair would say, a building for people they went to school and university with, but in an impoverished fashion. There's more urbanism. There was more urbanism before the French police destroyed that than there is in most high architecture today. Sorry, I've gone on far too long, but that's what I wanted to say. Thank you.
Thank you, Patrick. Yeah, what a wonderful ending, and an amazingly rich journey all the way through, materially and intellectually. So thank you. I'll turn to the questions immediately, and I think Nick Temple was going to be first up. So you're not off the hook.
Well, thank you, Patrick. That was an absolutely brilliant and thought-provoking lecture, encompassing many different aspects of your creative work and your written work. I'd like to just refer to your wonderful book, Civic Ground, because there's something in there that I think really kind of articulates your work in ways that are perhaps most revealing actually tonight in your presentation. When you talk about this idea of civicness or civilitas being related to both good government and to well-being, and then you talk about the idea of civic architecture actually having within it, implicit in it, both the intimate and the broader representational aspects of the city, of urban life. And I think that's made very evident, I think, in the work that you've produced here. There is something about the intimacy of the everyday experience of urban life against the backdrop of the city as a place of corporate activity and and profit and all the other things that go on within the structure of the city itself. But I'm interested particularly in exploring your reference to Alberti's idea of teaching his patrons about the virtues of civic life, and looking at your kind of comment about Hackney Council being an enlightened client, and in a way, how do you, when you're dealing with particular clients, looking at the example of Alberti, how do you take their guide them actually in your own thinking about architecture ultimately? And when we talk about this issue of the imagination, the journey of imagination, how it works through your surveying investigation of a Venetian palace and how that's translated into your own design work, is that something you reveal to your clients when you're presenting your work?
Yeah, when the project for Hackney was a two-stage competition, as things typically are, and the first stage is you need to demonstrate your financial robustness and previous experience, and then I think they chose 5 architects, and in this case I think there was East were involved, Social and Bates, Stephen Taylor, Doug Morris, May, I think Simon Henley, very good architects. And as part of the process of once we'd won the competition of demonstrating that we'd exhausted all other options, we had to kind of critique their schemes, and in the main it's fair to say they were all singular blocks. And when we presented our scheme, 3/4 of my presentation were photographs of the site and photographs of what we'd done elsewhere to fix kind of road engineering based urban design. And I think I was helped because I'd lived around the corner from that building for a number of years, and in fact Blaise Luxembourg lives in the top floor of that flat, has a flat in the top floor of that building. So we had we're lucky we had an intimate knowledge. But I do think in other versions of this talk I've referred to projects that we did with our CAS diploma students whilst I was doing the PhD, looking at the River Fleet, which is now Farringdon Road, and also the city centre of Porto, the effect of the bringing of road engineering into the city. So I've kind of learnt, I think, from the examples that Dalibor gives in his book about the rail lines crashing through Camden. So it's partly, I think these are kind of typical situations, and I think the beauty of phenomenology for architects is it's kind of misrepresented, I think, as a critical regionalism or materiality style. I don't think that's correct. I think partly in sociological terms, in contrast to kind of Marxist approach, phenomenology means participation. So you are in effect not top down. You're always bottom up. You're doing a form of investigation. You're curious about what's there. And of course, because as an architect you're trained to deal with kind of typicality, what you find very, very quickly is that things that you know academically are true and correct, but also things you know colloquially are accurate because you've lived there, people respond to very, very well. So I don't see a gap between the academic approach and being a human being. I kind of reference Mitzine very, very kind of obliquely, but you're just kind of being with other people. No client wants to build a crap building. Often the problem is who's advising them. So they only get access to, people in the media. People tell them that Thomas Heatherwick and Bianca Ingalls are really good, and Zaha Hadid and Norman Foster are really good. And when you're in a room, if you saw the documentary that was made about the competition in New York, in a kind of character of egomaniacs and lunatics, Norman Foster comes across as quite sensible and pragmatic in comparison.
I think on that very interesting point, Patrick, we should move to the next question if we could, Nick. Excuse me, Christian. I'm really interested to see how you question
thank
Patrick.
you. Thank you. Yeah, Patrick, really beautiful work. And what I'm really interested in is the idea of nature and the civic, because I think one of the things that architects that you've just described find very difficult is understanding of what one might mean by nature in a city. And often they counterpose civic as almost the antithesis of nature. And that's in a sense a part of, I think, part of the problem. And one of the interesting ways in which that Dalibor began to explore this sort of with the idea of the fragment and the way in which the ideas of the civic and nature begin to play off each other was an interesting shift away from someone like Sedlmeier, who I think saw the fragment as something rather negative, certainly in Art of Crisis, where he talks about nature being elevated off the ground and in a place that's not its natural position. And that's not a part of the idea of nature finds its way all the way through your work. And I was just interested because you use the word garden a lot more than you use the word nature. And I'm interested in that. Is that because you think that people understand gardens in a more in a simpler way, and that nature is more nuanced? Because for me, I think the gardens you're making are about a much more of a natural reference. They're relating to nature in the city. And it's interesting that you started off, for example, with your Suffolk or Norfolk house, which you called a villa, and then came at the end to the medieval town made almost as a sort of articulation of nature in a very simple and mundane but incredibly potent way. So I mean, it may be more of a comment than a question, but I think it's just very interesting and whether you had any comment on your use of the word nature in the way you describe your work to other people.
I think that there's a lot of antinomies, or as philosophers would say, or false oppositions created by the attempt to foreground scientific method, obviously, and there's good reasons why Descartes is trying to do that, because Protestants and Catholics are killing each other in France, and he's looking for a kind of falsifiable efficacy, and one consequence that we all kind of the Cambridge course, the MPhil course that we all of us have spoken so far have studied was to look at the consequences of this kind of dialectical error, if you like, whereby nature and or city and nature are seen in opposition to each other. It sounds clever when you start using Ruri and Urbi and this kind of stuff, but I think it's part of the problem of deseverance and distancing. It's much more precisely used garden. The problem is you get into nature, and then you get into the closest Alberti gets is second nature, which is this kind of theological argument that it's not blasphemous to be godlike or il divino and to complete God's grace through imagination. But the next thing you know, I mean, like literally the next thing you know, you've art historians teaching architecture as organic style, and then the next thing you know, you've got Greg Lynn, it's like immediately. It's like it happened so fast that it doesn't help. I mean, I use the word building physics. I think that's good because it's got thesis within it, but it's much more precise. It's like what do we do? Building physics. I mean, that's what Eric mentioned at the beginning about poetic economy of means. That one thing I think we need to do now is to reunite the various aspects of scientia, of knowledge, of scientific knowledge, bodily knowledge, hermeneutic readings of situation, because it's bred a kind of recklessness, where the scientific imagination doesn't really deal with the city, doesn't deal with the ground, doesn't deal with colloquial language, and a kind of overly romantic kind of subjectivity through phenomenology doesn't really deal with anything bigger than a door handle or a house, and I think those types of knowledge. The thing about the fragment is that I think what was really good about Dalibor's reading of the fragment was that it works both ways. that when technology smashes through urban order, you get these kind of ruined gardens and these kind of bits of space left over, which is where, you know, his imagination was led to the 30 odd years of projects with Peter and Moisen and people who are kind of looking at the potential to remake things. I think the trick is not to think that you can heal something, and to allow a kind of melancholy to coexist, but not to get obsessed with that kind of, which I think Rossi to some extent does, a kind of mourning for wholeness, and just to accept. I mean, the Chirico obviously is a kind of very good example of this, because the paintings have, you know, fragments of ancient cities, and then the horizon is a bloody train coming through, and what's left is the potential for the imagination to go either way. You know, you wouldn't really want to knock down all the kind of fragments of ancient buildings, but you also wouldn't get rid of the train line, because it's extremely convenient. It allows us to move between the countryside and the city, and move between cities in an efficient way. I just kind of think that what we haven't done is reconciled them into a narrative that can deal with the civic responsibility of a truly ecological aesthetic in architecture, which is both scientifically grounded in falsifiable knowledge, but then doesn't stop there. That isn't self-satisfied and basically worshipping man's own ingenuity and intelligence, but is also dealing with that which we inherit, that aspect of knowledge which is which I suppose you're picking up on subconsciously as a young person, with why you're attracted to buildings and landscapes as somebody who wants to study architecture, to try and retain that sense of being a human being alive to the world as other people are, and to try to be precise in one's language, like it's a garden. You know, but that garden, you know, the Villa Lante, you know, it's mostly water and statuary, and there are plants. You know, even a garden in a small courtyard in a city might have one tree and a small fountain. Might be mostly stone, but it's a stone garden nonetheless. So I guess it's an attempt to be precise and not to be distracted by language. I think too many architects, the discourse that we have is just full of jargon, and it doesn't help. It doesn't help people get closer to the lived experience of being in a building, which is really what the imagination is trying to do. I think talking with people is part of the participatory phenomenological act of being an architect, observing things and having discussions, and that becoming a dialogue, a feedback loop that if you're alive to, it means that it's a collaborative process. That doesn't mean that your job as an architect is not to, you know, literally be the design team leader.
Thanks.
I'm just wondering and hoping that Peter Carl is with us and would like to ask a question.
I don't feel absolutely moved to ask a question, but I'm happy to. I'll be very brief. Thank you, Patrick. That was very enjoyable. Lots of things to agree with, of course. Just a little quickie. One of the things in phenomenology is that both phenomenologists and people from the outside tend to place a high value on intimacy and on, you know, kind of friendship. There's a lot of the city that is a kind of anonymous solidarity. And I was just wondering, looking particularly at the Victoria Street projects, if there isn't a poetics of anonymity, or that is worth thinking about, that whereby, I mean, I think the standard view is that even, I don't know, the Palazzo di Giustizia in Milano, which is generally taken to be, you know, one of the muscly fascist buildings, has more to offer in architecture than the average office block with 9-meter bays. It's just an abstraction. And phenomenology's standard enemy are those conceptual configurations, as you hinted at with, you know, Eisenman and Rowe. And as far as I can tell, your way of coping with that and Victoria Street is a really good lab for that, because you've got all those, you know, 10-story abstractions, you know, lurking in the background, and how to suggest you're never going to get to Borough High Street, but you might get to some new kind of street. But as far as I can tell, what happens above, say, the first floor is mostly rhythm. Is that a fair way of saying that that's the basis? I mean, I wasn't entirely following the link between the Cadoro and your facade. The Cadoro was justifying the facade rather than the other way around. But I think the idea that you have that on your mind is the problem of those generalizations that are 12, 15, 20 stories. Are we better off than, say, Art Deco, where you get 50-story buildings that nevertheless address a street, seem to convey some sort of civic presence? I think it's an open question, but I'm intrigued by that. You're absolutely at home as you get closer to scale, materials, sustainability, and completely with you, nature, all those sorts of issues. City gives a direction to. By the way, there's a one-liner about doctors and God that may also have to do with architects. There's a difference between a doctor and God, is that God doesn't dream of being a doctor. But at any rate, maybe there isn't an answer, but I'm intrigued by that the potential urban poetics of the anonymous order.
I think that's exactly what I'm doing. I think that I have very much aware that the beauty of the city is that you can be anonymous. If you come from a small place, everybody knows your business and blah blah blah. And I think I was fortunate in that we designed the stone concrete building next to Frank Matcham's Theatre before we got on to the other stuff, because I think that gave us the capacity to see it for what it was. It's a block of flats and an office building, and therefore the tendency to chuck the kitchen sink at your first major building was we could resist it, because we could see it really as what was necessary was good background, better background than the faceless, anonymous corporate buildings of the 50s, but a kind of anonymity with a face. But of course that face shouldn't be my face, and it's not a building for an individual client. It's not a singular palazzo. It is perhaps my own failing or weakness is, but I think it's also a problem of our time. Is yes, like you, I also kind of drawn to these Art Deco buildings in Manhattan and in Brussels and in Berlin, and I think they're brilliant. But I have no access to knowing how to do it, and I sort of admire people like Fat who've tried to do so. But part of the problem is, and I really didn't like it when Herzog and de Meuron and then all of their imitators started to get into ornament. It's as if they were looking at Owen, what's his name's kind of the grammar of ornament, and everything's just sort of pattern, and that a deeper understanding of nature or ecology might be its ethical dimension, and that therefore architecture is a sort of anonymous carapace or armature or screen, which then allows other human beings identity to change the architecture. Feels to me like what is possible. And at certain points, the buildings become very articulate. So the side of the town hall, it's the town hall. So we had the chance to give the town hall a kind of gravitas and representational character. But the trick was not to do it in bright colours and mocking the paucity of material quality of the existing building. So Luke, who's just left the office, always says, he beautifully describes it as the trick is to always do just enough, and then to take out as much as you can until it falls down in terms of having any resonance, and then put back just enough so that it's there and it's available for people. And that might be our predilection here as a group of people who feel uncomfortable with trying to be artists or specifically trying to be sculptors, and thinking that if you collaborate with people who are much more talented in that way, there will be enough kind of richness there. yes, the problem we have in most of these buildings in that situation is a lack of section. I didn't mention, because I'm still kind of trying to come to terms with it psychologically, is that one effect of COVID is that the Westminster City Council have decided they don't want a library, and they're taking £10 million commuted sum instead. But yeah, there's nothing I can do about that. I can't. Nobody can do anything about that. It's, you know, we tried our best. But interestingly, there is still going to be section in that, you know, funny timber building at the back of the theatre. There's an entrance through a constituted pawnbrokers to a restaurant at the level of the top of the theatre, and there's still going to be this public room at first floor, which will be used for conferences. And bizarrely, business speak now it's full of terms like seminar and symposium and the kind of sort of academic language. So there's a kind of depth and section. But yeah, it's mostly kind of, I mean, corporate, you know, it's kind of, it is what it is. The Coroner's Court has section, obviously, and it has programme, and it has a highly orchestrated emotional content. I guess that the thing is, what we're not doing, which our contemporaries and people slightly older than us started doing, is that the art gallery became a kind of, you know, secular, sacred thing you did on a Sunday instead of go to church, and has its kind of crescendos, and it's, you know, take modern as a kind of, you know, cathedral of industry turned into cathedral of culture. That people aren't building them at the moment. You know, I think the best we can hope for is a kind of housing that mixes workspace, community spaces, some decent restaurants, and above it a kind of hopefully kind of architecture of reserve, which allows people to take ownership of it. And that's kind of extreme modesty, extreme vulnerability of a position. But on the other hand, having to kind of deal with the plethora of functions of turning circles of vehicles and, you know, road engineering, the stuff that usually dominates, and that sometimes architecture, you know, in Joseph Whitworth's phrase Emirate style, attempts to kind of pretend that by making a building like a sort of sculpture, that reality isn't there. I'm hopeful. I mean, last time I saw Dalibor before he died, he said when the building was a library, I interviewed him for the Venice Biennale in 2012, and he said, looks like an office building. Looks like a really nice office building. Maybe at some point your imagination, your creativity, you might get some better clients and some better work. And kind of thanks, Dalibor. It would be great, but I mean, we seem to be we're not in the age of building cathedrals, are we? And we're not really. I sincerely believe local councils building social housing again, and us getting the chance to mediate between the mistakes of the kind of 60s, you know, top-down stuff and this kind of fragment situation. There's enough in that, I think, for a career. I think it would be a noble endeavour to make housing for poor people, and you know, build some of it and have a mixed community. You know, some work. The interesting thing about that project economically is there's 3 buildings, and one of them, which has got the market flats, pays for everything else. You know, and that's I think what Alberti was kind of getting at when he's, you know, emphasising the civic role of an architect, that you're spending people's money and you're encouraging them to do it well, and if you can make them a profit and make them feel proud of what they're doing and people don't hate them, then your advocacy is probably as important as anything else. I do think, though, that rhythm is important. I do think the tectonics are important. I do think actually that form making is important, but for me, form making comes out of those things. It's not an abstract activity.
One of the issues, I think, maybe I'm looking for other hands, but in the absence, I think we've probably hit our time. But I wanted to say that, you know, as backdrop, actually, returning to the issue of the street and how it's used seems to me a very fundamental issue. So that you know, on the ground, beyond the capacity of art, visual art, and other issues, just the way that the street is taken back and understood in terms of its passage and its uses, you know, from, as you pointed out, the nexus of transportation at one end and the Houses of Parliament at the other would be very interesting as a kind of issue that takes us beyond the individual architect to theatre performance and how we can contribute to that. And maybe that's a topic that we can come back to, you know, in one of these seminars. So I think, you know, regretfully, I'm going to suggest we call it a day, but huge thanks for a massively creative and fascinating contribution. Thank you, Patrick Lynch.
Thanks, guys. Thanks for inviting me. Good luck with everything. It's a joy to be part of this.
Thank you so much.
Good to see you all.
Really enjoyed that.
Thank you. Good to see you.
Thanks, Patrick.
Thank you very much.
Take care.
Cheers, fellas.
Bye-bye.